Deep within the hills of England, the rolling fields and hidden streams, the dark forests and climbing mountains, a small city dwelt. And yet it was a small city with a monstrous foe. A large, terrifying, staggering beast terrorized the people. This was no mere beast, but a serpentine terror, whose breath scorched the earth and poisoned the air. The people, desperate and afraid, tried to appease the dragon with offerings, first of sheep, then of cattle. But when their livestock failed to satisfy the creature's hunger, they began to offer human sacrifices, drawn by lot. Then came the day when the lot fell to the king's daughter. Crowned in sorrow and dressed in bridal garments, she was led out beyond the city gates to meet her fate. She stood alone by the lake, the waters dark and thick with the dragon's foul stench. The people watched from a distance, too fearful to intervene. From a distant hill, a figure appeared, mounted on a great steed and bearing a crimson cross on his shield. He was a stranger to the land. His name was George. He was clad in the armour of the Romans, spear in hand. He had been wandering the hills and stumbled across this detestable scene. Moved with compassion and righteous anger, George vowed to save the princess. As the dragon emerged, its terrifying roaring made the earth tremble. George made the sign of the cross and charged. The clash was terrible, the lance shattering against the beast's scales. But George fought on, striking with sword and with faith. Eventually, he subdued the dragon, bringing the beast low, and, with the princess's girdle, led the wounded beast back to the city like a tame dog. There, before the awestruck crowds, he proclaimed the power of Christ and called the people to repentance and baptism. At once, the dragon was slain, and the town turned to God. George had slain the dragon. But this story was only the beginning. This tale, first appearing in full form in the 11th century Golden Legend by Jacobus de Voragny, was not merely a moral fable. It was a symbolic narrative, rich with spiritual meaning, the triumph of Christian virtue over pagan darkness, the courage of faith in the face of evil, and the transforming power of divine truth. Amidst the dragons and miracles, it is easy to forget that behind the legend stands a real man, a martyr of the early church, whose story predates the medieval embellishments by centuries. Most historians agree that George was a Christian soldier who lived during the reign of the Roman Emperor Diocletian, around 284 to 305 AD. Whose brutal persecution of Christians stands among the fiercest of the early centuries. The earliest known reference to George by name comes from the early 4th century and suggests a martyr of Cappadocian origin, in what is now central Turkey. By the early 300s, stories of his martyrdom had already begun to circulate in Christian communities, from the Eastern Mediterranean to North Africa. George's historicity is supported not by a single detailed biography, but by a convergence of early liturgical references, church dedications, and martyrologies. He is first mentioned in the 4th century Decretum Gelasianum, a document concerning which writings were considered orthodox. His feast appears in the Jerome Martyrology, a Latin calendar of saints compiled in the 5th century, which places George's death in the city of Diasporos, or Lydda, on April the 23rd, the date that would later become his feast day across Christendom. Eusebius of Caesarea, a contemporary historian and bishop, wrote extensively on the martyrs of the Diocletianic persecution in his Ecclesiastical History and Martyrs of Palestine. Though he does not mention George by name, many scholars believe George was one of the unnamed soldiers who refused to renounce Christ and was executed for his loyalty to the faith. Later Eastern traditions filled the gaps, naming George explicitly and preserving oral traditions about his life. According to these traditions, George was born into a noble Christian family in Cappadocia, and after the death of his father, he moved with his mother to Lydda, in modern-day Israel. Like many young men of status in the Roman Empire, George entered military service, where he quickly rose through the ranks, gaining favour for his skill and integrity. When Diocletian began his crackdown on Christians, George, then an officer of high standing, openly defied the imperial decree. Some accounts say he tore down the emperor's edict in a public square. Others describe a more formal refusal to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods. What followed was a prolonged and horrific ordeal. George was imprisoned, tortured with iron hooks, scourged, placed on a wheel of swords, and forced to drink poison. But he endured it all without recanting. His tormentors, astonished at his resilience, even brought him before the emperor in a last-ditch effort to break his spirit. George remained unwavering, boldly proclaiming the supremacy of Christ over Caesar. At last, he was beheaded. According to some accounts, this occurred in Nicomedia, in modern Turkey. Others place his death in Lydda. Though the historical details remain contested, the persistence and consistency of George's martyrdom across multiple early traditions suggest more than myth-making. His story appears not as an isolated anecdote, but as part of the lived memory of persecuted Christians, who remembered him as a model of faithful endurance under pressure. The breadth of his early cult also suggests the conclusion that George was a real person. Within just a century of his death, churches dedicated to him could be found across Palestine, Egypt, and even Constantinople. Pilgrims travelled to his shrine in Lydda, where relics were believed to offer healing and protection. His veneration was not confined to one region or sect, but spanned the theological divides that would later fracture the church, suggesting a figure of profound, early, and widespread influence. It is also worth noting that the historicity of early Christian martyrs is often challenged due to the scarcity of Roman documentation. However, the empire rarely recorded executions of minor officials or military personnel unless politically significant. The silence of Roman archives on George's death is not unusual, and does not negate the evidence preserved by the Church, especially when corroborated across multiple cultural and linguistic traditions. While it is difficult to reconstruct his biography with the precision modern readers might desire, the weight of historical and ecclesiastical tradition strongly supports the existence of a St. George as a Christian martyr of the early 4th century. Whether he really was a dragon slayer is up for debate. But one thing remains true and consistent throughout the stories. He was a man of conviction, who chose the path of suffering rather than deny his Lord. This man, remembered for his spiritual steadfastness and for the later stories of his heroism and military conquest, became a beacon of hope in an age of fear. His story, rooted in truth and elevated by faith, inspired generations of Christians to stand firm in the face of evil, and remains a powerful testimony to the reality of grace under fire. Eastern hagiographies emphasize not only his martyrdom, but also his spiritual battles against demonic forces, a theme that may have contributed to the later dragon motif. In one early tradition, George is said to have appeared in visions to believers, healed the sick, cast out demons, and even raised the dead. His name became synonymous with protection and spiritual warfare. Western Christianity adopted George's cult more gradually, but by the time of the early medieval period, he was honoured across Europe. His feast day, April the 23rd, was observed in many regions, and he was invoked by soldiers, knights, and crusaders. Importantly, these saintly stories were never mere fantasy. They served as catechetical tools, embodying Christian virtues of courage, purity, and sacrificial love. They lifted the eyes of believers beyond earthly struggles to the cosmic battle between light and darkness. The story of St. George's rise as a military patron saint is deeply intertwined with the Crusades. As Christian armies marched to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Islamic rule, they sought divine favour and spiritual inspiration. St. George, the soldier martyr, became a natural figure of devotion. During the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, numerous reports emerged of St. George appearing in visions or leading heavenly armies. Chroniclers like Fulcher of Chartres and William of Tyre described miraculous interventions in battle, where a white-clad horseman bearing a red cross fought alongside the faithful. These sightings reinforce the belief that George was not only a saint of old, but a present help in time of war. The red cross on a white background, later known as the Cross of St. George, became a symbol of crusading zeal. It adorned banners, shields, and tunics. Over time, this image came to represent not only a saint, but the ideal Christian warrior, devout, courageous, and unyielding. It is no coincidence that as the Crusades progressed, St. George supplanted other saints in popular devotion. He represented a chivalric ideal, combining spiritual purity with martial valour. For a world at war, he was the perfect patron. But how did this Cappadocian martyr become the patron saint of England? The association began in the 12th century. King Richard I, the Lionheart, adopted St. George as his protector during the Third Crusade. English soldiers reported visions of George aiding them in battle, and his name became a battle cry: St. George for England. By the 14th century, the connection was formalised. In 1348, King Edward III established the Order of the Garter, England's highest order of chivalry, under the patronage of St. George. St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle was built as its spiritual home, and annual celebrations were held on April the 23rd in his honour. The reasons for George's elevation in English culture are manifold. He offered a unifying symbol amid political fragmentation. He was neither Roman nor Celtic, neither northern nor southern, making him a neutral figure for an emerging national identity. His martial virtues appealed to the knightly class, while his piety inspired the devout. By the time of the Reformation, St. George had become woven into the fabric of English identity. Although Protestants rejected the invocation of the saints, George's legacy was recast, not as a heavenly intercessor, but as a moral exemplar, a Christian knight whose story could inspire courage and fidelity to the truth. The dragon in George's legend has been interpreted in many ways. Historically, it may have been derived from pagan myths or been influenced by Eastern Christian stories of spiritual warfare. But theologically, the dragon is a fitting symbol of sin, death, and Satan, monsters that terrorize the soul and the world alike. George's victory over the dragon then becomes an allegory, not of physical strength alone, but of spiritual victory through Christ. The sword is the word, the shield is faith, the armor is righteousness, the triumph is divine. The story has also served political purposes. In times of war or plague, George was invoked for deliverance. In times of crisis, his image reminded rulers and subjects alike of the call to courage and moral integrity. His iconography, white horse, red cross, shining spear, remains potent, evoking both the medieval knight and the Christian warrior standing against the darkness. Though centuries have passed since the Crusades, and the medieval knight has vanished from the battlefield, St. George's legacy continues. His feast day, April 23rd, is still observed in England and other nations. Churches across the world bear his name. His story is taught in schools, invoked in literature, and celebrated in parades. His red cross remains a symbol on the flag of England, and by extension, the Union Jack. Yet his story is not merely about national pride. It is a reminder of the virtues that transcend time. Courage in the face of fear, faith in the midst of doubt, and the call to stand for what is true even unto death. In a world increasingly disoriented by moral ambiguity and spiritual confusion, St. George continues to challenge and inspire. He does not call us to take up arms, but to take up the cross. He does not slay literal dragons, but points to the one who crushed the serpent's head. In that sense, George's dragon is every Christian's battle. His victory is not his own, but Christ's. And his story, strange, stirring, and enduring, is ultimately one of redemption. The story of St. George and the dragon is more than myth. It is a window into the heart of Christian witness and the soul of a people shaped by that witness. Behind the legend stands a real man, faithful unto death, courageous in truth, and honoured across the centuries, not for what he imagined himself to be, but for what God made him to be. A martyr, a saint, and a symbol of the triumph of light over darkness. In tracing his history, from Cappadocian soldier to English patron, we find a tale that is both historical and eternal. His dragon may be slain, but his example lives on.